From the 2013 Spring Roundup, Wally Congdon, The Drover Road.
Our last speaker, I hope you already know him, and you've already talked to him. This is Wally Congdon, and we're really grateful to have him from Montana. Wally is a lawyer, and Wally is a beef producer. Let me say that again. Wally is a lawyer and a beef producer, which means he's really articulate, good old boy. He's going to talk to us about the history and the culture of the cattle industry, where we've come from. And hopefully, as we know, history helps us understand where we're going. So let's welcome Wally.
Thank you, Professor.
So is the cattle business supplementing the lawyer business or the other way around?
I will tell you last thing why I don't practice law all the time. That is part of the story. So for the fun of it, here's what I'd suggest you do. Put up your feet and don't take any of this too seriously, because it's not. So I will tell you how I got here, what the story is, what the scoop is, and this story is you. And it's a hard thing to admit, and there's some great quotes that come out of it. So part of what drove this bus was a quote by a gentleman from Montana whose parents were Scots named Granville Stewart. He said this in 1785, and few people quote it, few people know it, and it's very simple. You have no idea where you're going unless you have a good understanding about where you've been. That's a delightful quote from a Scotsman 130 years ago. Because you have no idea where you're going unless you do have a good understanding about where you've been. And this is where you've actually been. And what led to this conclusion is something that I'll read you. And don't be surprised that I do it, because I've read it 2 or 3 times here. But this is how we got this story. This, for what it's worth, is Section 42 of the United States Code Annotated, Section 4331. That is the lawyer in me talking. 42 U.S.C. 4331, and I want you to listen carefully to what it is. It is the congressional declaration that the Congress, recognizing the profound impact of man's activity on the interrelations of all components of the natural environment, and recognizing further the critical importance of restoring and maintaining environmental quality to the overall welfare and development of man, declares that it is a continuing policy of the federal government to create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony and fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations. In order to carry out the policy set forth in this chapter, it is the responsibility of the federal government to use all practicable means consistent with other provisions of essential national policy to improve and coordinate federal plans, functions, and resources to the end that the nation may, and they list a number of things. The one that matters to all of us that we don't talk about is item number 4. So I'll read you the last sentence. To improve and coordinate federal functions, programs, plans, and resources, to the end that the nation may preserve important historic, cultural, and natural aspects of our national heritage, and maintain wherever possible an environment which supports diversity and variety of individual choice. I choose you to ranch. Everybody wants to be a cowboy, and we are the custom, culture, history, and national heritage of the West. No one talks about it. It's a card very few people have played, but to find out really what is our historic, cultural heritage in respect to the cattle culture, we set out on a mission. Who are we? Where do we come from? And what is the story? And that is the Drover Road. I personally like the way Peanuts starts this story a lot. It was a dark and stormy night. And it's always a dark and stormy night in Scotland. If you've ever been there, believe me, it is. And that's a tough pull. But our problem originally in Scotland wasn't anything to do with government. It wasn't anything to do with all sorts of other problems like trade or money or employment or whatever. Our biggest problem to start was the damn Vikings. But they only had their way with us for like 250 years. And we finally figured out by about 1200 that by then, a Scotsman is really nothing more than a very short Norwegian with a really bad speech problem. And we've never solved the speech problem ever, lad. That's how it is, you know? We can't help it in that part of the world. So we didn't. But the reality was our heritage for the Drover Road is very old. So if you look back in the records, what you'll find is this. The best news came in 1359, because that is the year that the 50-year war with England finally was over, and we, the Drovers of Scotland, received a license for free passage to trade and drive cattle and beef to England. So nearly 700 years ago, for the first time, we had a market to trail cattle wherever we wanted to trail them, south of Hadrian's Wall. The Romans didn't like us either. They didn't invite us to play, they just built a wall to keep us out. I don't blame them either. So our commerce in cattle increased incredibly. By 1739, if you read the Exchequer of Scotland's records, you'll find in 1379, we exported 51,000 hides. That is way before Columbus. And for what it's worth, the first year of the cattle drives up the Chisholm Trail, the total trailed was 50,000 cows. So we sold more hides 200 years before Columbus almost, at least 120 years before Columbus, than went up the Chisholm Trail the first year they did it. The Drover Road started in Inverness. We swam the cattle from the Isle of Skye, the Isle of Man, and the rest, or we tied their horns, we wrapped up their feet in a hide, and we rode them across. And we didn't have a lot of horses. We had no money. We were Scots, and if we had it, we wouldn't have spent it anyway. So that being the case, what we did to drove them is we walked. And we trailed them all the way. The first big hit on the subject came about 300 years later, when a certain gentleman named Sir Walter Scott published a book called Rob Roy. You've all seen the movie, you know the man, you know the tale, but what boosted him to fame was not that book. It was the story he wrote before that. The one that was simple, lad, The Tale of Two Drovers. And that was the basis for a lot of different stories and a lot of history. Sir Walter Scott's record was fabulous. So for the next 150 years after 1379, it was a good time. We had a long tradition of doing the thing we liked best. That wasn't just trailing cattle. And I do raise beef for a living, but I'll tell you the Scotsman's first secret about that, but you can't repeat it. I will admit only to you, but nowhere else, I do not raise the best tasting beef in the world. My neighbor does when it's in my freezer and he doesn't know it. Now that is how a Scotsman raises damn good beef, no questions asked. So what we did for the next 150 years or so was the crèche. And the crèche was the thing you call in the West rustling, theft, pillaging, plundering. So we always took the neighbor's cows when we could, and especially we didn't like the boys in Aberdeenshire, we didn't like the boys in Tillymore because they were wrong. So we'd trail 200 miles across all of Scotland and down to the south to take those English dogs' cattle and bring them home. And we did plenty of it. And we had no brand inspectors, so it didn't matter, because if that 50,000 hides a year happened to be a cow that spoke with an English moo, we were happier, because it was a lot easier to get it, and we didn't have as much money in it. So we did it for a long time. So the term later became called esprit, which is what we called theft, and actually the true word ended in 1883, because until 1883 in the old country, cattle trysting was legal. It wasn't theft. Trysting was borrowing. We just borrowed another clan's cows, just for a few days, or for a few years, or for a few months, or for a little while, and it was okay. So we did all the trysting we could do, and it took another almost 300 years before we made that illegal in 1883. But by then, some of us had left. So demand increased. And the first thing that drives all of our buses in the West happened in 1603. England and Scotland united under King James VI, who became King James I, depending on which side of the wall you were from. And we had this little issue. The problems we had was persecution of people of other religions, persecutions of persons who were Catholic, persons who were Protestants. We were not Protestants. That's a typical American mispronunciation. You know, we don't say stuff right, our letters are in the wrong order in words, and we drive on the wrong side of the road, and we don't say it right. A Protestant is what we call it. But in the old country, we were a Protestant. And we were persecuted against. And over what they'd done to the Catholics, our little buddy Guy filled the entire basement of the Parliament building with gunpowder on November 3rd, 1605. And so they hung him on November 6th. But Guy Fawkes Day is celebrated on November 5th every year throughout the entire Commonwealth. Remember the days of November, Guy Fawkes, Guy Fawkes. It's a rhyme known by every person from a Commonwealth country. And what we celebrate by having a huge bonfire every November 5th is our custom, our independence, our freedom of persecution by government, our freedom from discrimination and harassment and intervention by powers. So 500 years later, on the first day of Parliament every year, they do not open the doors till they have checked the basement of Parliament to see if it's full of gunpowder. It is called the Gunpowder Plot. And why is it that a number of years later, when a number of guys who spoke with a really bad speech problem showed up in the West, they started the same tradition here, and every year that is why, for homecoming, you have a bonfire. Texas A&M, founded originally by Grants and the people of Aberdeenshire, the Texas College banned its bonfire 2 years ago. It was the size of a football field, collapsed and killed 3. Every small school in the West has a bonfire for homecoming to celebrate our independence, what we did, how we did, and how we had it. And who would have thought that a whole bunch of Brits, etc., all those years ago would have a tradition and a statement about government that we adopted in all our schools as part of a senior-junior ritual and our homecoming, and we never talk about it. So the Drover Road was not just tailoring cows, it's the other stuff. And what we also were besides then was not just drovers, we were crofters. And a crofter was a Scots farmer drover who had a small house. And every spring you say what we said, and you don't know where it came from. We lived on the first floor in the basement or next door right there. We kept our cattle and sheep all winter. And we did that because Scotland's wet, it's damp, and it's cold, and they're warm. And guess what lived in the attic? All winter were our cats and our dogs. Because it was nice, it was warm there, and had a ball time. And in the spring, about April or May, when the weather turned, it started to do things like rain all the time and big things. And on the first big rain of the spring, what happens? It's raining cats and dogs. Because all the cats and dogs in the attic hit us because our thatch roof has finally deteriorated after the entire winter. So hence the drovers brought us not only the question of do we trail cows, do we have a tradition for homecoming, they also brought us what we say every spring when it is raining, cats and dogs. And that was part of the Drover Road. And it was a delightful thing. By 1750, we'd increased the demand for cattle incredibly. Beginning in 1740, the Campbell clan experimented with our native cattle. And our native cattle were interesting to say the least. And what we wanted to do is upgrade those cattle and take some of our southern Scots cattle and make them a little better. We wanted a little bigger frame. We wanted a little more fat. We wanted to be a little wider on the back. We wanted them a little thicker. And we wanted them to do what they'd been doing for us for a while better, because we used those cattle for 3 things. 1, they were used for beef. More importantly, they were used for draft, because that's what we used to pull things. And finally, we also milked a good bunch. So we had one particular breed of cow we perfected that went everywhere in the world starting about 1670. In the old country, if you talk to the right people, they're called a Teeswater, because they were from the area of Teeswater. Or if you read the old books, you'll see something referred to as a Durham. We also named tobacco after them, Bull Durham. And what we call them is a shorthorn. So it's an amazing thing, but what the Pilgrims probably brought were shorthorn derivatives to start cattle. What made the entire West was that. So we perfected the triple purpose breed, and that's what we had. So, like Mr. Scott said to the captain all the time, we needed more power. We always want more power because we're from Scotland. And we didn't get it with money because we were too tight to charge it or to do it otherwise. What we did it with is we decided we'll take the world with cows. Aberdeen Angus is an old story, guys, in the last 40 years. We did it with Durhams 200 years ago. When I judge fairs, a lot of people get a little bent when I talk about the fact they have a really nice Durham Mansell. That's a fine-looking creature. I haven't seen a Durham Mansell for a time that looked that good. What you call a Durham Mansell is a Maine Anjou to you. It's a Durham Mansell to me because it's half Durham and half Mansell from the south of France. There are 40-some breeds of cattle in the last 200 years that the Scots are totally charged with having created using Durhams as half the bloodline. It's phenomenal. So we did take the world, not with Aberdeen Angus. We took the world with Durhams. And they almost all were, because everyone wanted to improve their stock. And that's what we went to work on doing. And we shipped them everywhere. Read the records of the West. The first upgrades were Durham cattle. What's even more delightful is they were also our first cows. Besides Plymouth and Jamestown and how the drovers did it, by 1857 you'll find a Scotsman named John Grant was living in a little place called Fort Bannock and trailing cattle to a place called Deer Lodge, Montana. And what he was doing was not picking up what nobody picked up till 1880, which were Texas Longhorns. He was picking up Durham cattle and Durham milk cows off of the Oregon Trail. By the time they got to that part of Idaho, their feet were tired, they were thin, and the ear was long. So what you did is you set up a trading system. So here was the gig, guys. John Grant went to work and he did well. A Scots boy said, look, I'll give you one good ox for 2 of your tired oxen. I'll give you 1 good milk cow for 2 good milk cows, or better yet, for 1 milk cow which is tired but still good if she's got a heifer calf. And that is how Grant built the cow herd that became what was that portion of Montana's cattle, which is the first real cow herd in this part of the world. He didn't trail them in from Oregon. He didn't trail them from Texas. He didn't trail them from Canada. They didn't come up the river from St. Louis. He traded them as transportation for the people who came up the Oregon Trail. Only a Scotsman would figure out the trading rate, the trading amount, and there it works. And now, 160 years later, the Grant Coors Ranch is the National Park, National Historic Site at Deer Lodge, Montana. And what's even better is who he sold to and partnered with later was not another cowman. Only a Scotsman would figure out the guy you want to team up with is a butcher. And that is what Conrad Coors was. So a butcher has the place, and a Scots drover was picking the cows. And it's still there. That's the history of how we did it, and that's how we got it. And when he had gotten there at that time, by about 1859 or 60, word was out. And a whole bunch of boys from Scotland had come to this country, and they came west. And here was the story. They had no medical marijuana card. They were not residents of Colorado. But when they got to the Great Plains, they looked out and said, wow, look at the grass. And it was phenomenal. And the grass was, because in Scotland there's a lot of grass, it's not very good, it's relatively poor, and we had gobs of it. So the whole success on the East Coast for a couple hundred years was there, but now suddenly what they looked at was the West. And blame part of that on another Scotsman named Mackenzie, who happened to walk across southern Canada, the northern Great Plains, in 1787, 88, and 89. And Lewis and Clark had his journals and his records and his maps. So the Scots boys and the drovers really did do it. And Mackenzie's records came with Lewis and Clark and got handed out later when other people read the books, and Thomas Jefferson had his originals before Lewis and Clark left. So they knew it was here, and they set it up to do it, and they did. So things then started to change quickly. By 1865, the demand for beef went way up. Two things occurred. One, the war was almost over, and then the war was over. And two, what happened then is suddenly we realized we had a huge surplus of beef in Texas that no one had taken anywhere for a long time. So what we suddenly wanted were people to trail them north. A lot of people, and we were a very mixed lot. And out of that thing, two things happened. One, we came from Scotland, because we were drovers, we had expertise, we knew how to breed things, and we could move cattle. That was cool. And number two, besides that, the other part is we had a mixed lot to work with of people who were just like us. Beat up by their government, beat up by other people, and not liked. Look at the history. If you found 10 drovers, 2 were black, 2 were Mexican, and the other 6 were white. That is the drovers. That is the cowboys we know. That is our heritage. And those were the numbers. So when you looked at it in 1865, it started to look really promising, and things looked really good. So a couple things happened. We came in numbers as Scotsmen. It looked like a real booming business. Let's start trailing cows. And we did. And when we did it, the numbers went nuts. So the first year that we trailed numbers was 1867. 35,000 head went to Abilene. 1868, 75,000. 1869, 350,000. 1870, only 300,000. 1871, 600,000. So when I say it took off in a hurry, they went from 35,000 head trailed in 1867, none in 1866, to more than 500,000 cattle before 1875. So it changed incredibly, and that brought us then two things. Obviously, if they're making money trailing cows, we should invest. So what were the names that showed up? You know every one of them. You just don't talk often about the part of our history which says they're all from a small country in the north of England. John Chisholm, Charles Goodnight, Murdo Grant, William Clay, William McTeague, William Tisdale, John Tisdale, and the other companies you know were all funded. 33 companies were funded in Scotland in 1870 for brokering land and cattle in the western U.S. And 3 particular ranches had a huge success. The Swan Cattle Company took off and did fine, and their subsequent competitor, the XIT, trailed cows by you. By 1884, they trailed all the cattle from Texas they could gather through the Powder River country through Wyoming, and they had all of the grazing in Montana between the Yellowstone and the Missouri. All of it. Their headquarters stayed there until 1928 when they sold. Only a person named Murdo Mackenzie with an Oxford education would write the brand that says what you actually own in Texas. 3 million acres in exchange for Scots money funding the Capitol building and some other things. And lo and behold, Roman numeral 10 IT stands for 10 in Texas. 10 entire townships is what we owned, and all of central Montana. And the American Land and Cattle Company did the same thing. They had lots of it, and there were about 20 others. The Prairie Cattle Company had similar success and did it well. So into the 80s, things looked rosy. It was a fabulous time. But then we started to hit the wall on a few small issues. The first was downright ugly, because the Vikings had had a hard time with us, and they hadn't solved our speech problem. And when we got here and started to talk to people, This is what happened. No matter how you say it, it's all the same. They got words that describe everything from their clothes to only heaven knows. A sombrero, a Stetson, a hat, a cap, a bandana, a neckerchief, a scarf, or a woolen. But we gave up on that because it was too hot in the summer. We had a vest and a slicker and a duster. And we had chaps, short from the Spanish word that we didn't speak in Scotland, chapadiara, standing for leg armor. And there were all sorts of kinds. I liked the ones that would let me fly. Bat wings, lean back, and away you go. And shotguns, and for the guys who herded sheep, there were woolies. And besides that, we had things on our feet called herks, spurs, jingle bobs, packers. I don't know if you understand or not, but now that you've covered those from your head to your toe, there's also the question of your cows. They were black, they were red, they were white, they were speckled, they were mottled, they were brindled, they were spotted, they were drop-horned, they were chongos, they were hookers, or they were dotted, or humlied, or polled, which is what we called them in the old country that way. So now that you're covered and your cows are too, there was talk of the horses you rode. And that talk was hard to understand as well. There was a dun, a lineback, a grulla, a buckskin, a bay, a piebald, a claybank, and a sorrel. And if that wasn't enough, there was a bold-faced, glass-eyed appy. By 1877, we learned in simple terms why Custer's Last Stand was so ugly. The Indians were really in a bad mood because they had to ride Appaloosa horses. It was ugly. And what a horse could do to us was even worse. They could rimfire. They could buck. They could do all sorts of things like that. They could sunfish. They could crow hop. They could walk. They could trot. They could lope. They could canter. They could run. And they could gallop. And besides that, there was what we could do to a horse. We could fork him. We could feed him. We could ride him, we could roll him, we could pull him, we could throw him, we could chase him, we could cuss him, and we could drive him. Those were all the things we could do. And it was hard because we only spoke Gaelic. It wasn't easy at all. And later in life I learned it was like Latin, a dead language, as dead as it could be. First it killed the Romans, and now it's killing me. And Gaelic probably did the same thing for those poor boys. And you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And there's all sorts of things that we have to call ourselves and those other guys. So those other guys are buckaroos, rustlers, waddies, wranglers, the cookie, Little Mary, who was called that, who helped the cook, but it didn't matter. Their sex, their gender, their height, their age. That was Little Mary. The cowboss, the puncher, the cowpoke, the cowman, the cowboy, the drover, the vaquero, or the taquero. Who are we, what are we, and where did we come from, and how do we speak it? And then what we did, we had men who rode drag, who rode flank, who rode point, who rode side, who rode head, and who rode tail. All of the above. And if that wasn't enough, there was the tallyman, the swing rider, the swagman, the bullwhacker, and the boss. And a button, a slicker, a tenderfoot, and a dude. And at mealtime, you have your chuck at the chuck wagon. Cooked by Cookie and his helper. And if the chuck isn't good, you chuck it up. And we didn't have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We had breakfast, dinner, and supper. And you change your speech pattern there, too. So now if you've had too much of my good scotch, you're not chucking it up, you're blowing your lunch. So we change our whole pattern based on our custom, our history, our culture, and our heritage. And you may get the backdoor trots, the Rocky Mountain quickstep, or things like that. And if we're talking, we're BSing, we're telling Wendy's, we're BSing, we're bamboozling, we're weather sketching, we're spreading the blarney, we're just airing our lungs to see if they work. So here's how the tale worked. This is how it goes. One buckaroo left camp to go fetch an old mossback brindle lophorn steer. He was riding a half-broke piebald, and he had a greenhorn button following along. And The steer was found brushed up in a coulee, so he sends in his Catahoula hound to fetch him out, while the old steer comes boiling out like a house of fire, tries hooking the bronc, which shies to the left, and we J-poke him to the right, and we run into a stop, and if it weren't for our chinks, we'd have a terrible gash in our leg. So we run him down, rope him up, dally him down, and drag him back. Even today, we still would have changed a few words. We don't rope them at my house. We give them a nylon vaccine. And that nylon vaccine is very effective. Works fine. Don't have to do it twice. Usually one dose lasts forever. It's a cool deal. So the language was a bit of an issue. Who said what? Who did it? And how did we do it? So we had simple people who did it, and by 1887, the success was so great that year the Congress passed a law. There can be no more investment in land in the West by foreigners. You Scots boys and you Englishmen cannot buy it here anymore. They shut us out. So at that point, we had only 2 options available, and those 2 quickly became 5. In 1841, we passed the Preemption Act, which left us homestead. In 1862, we made it more official and passed the Homestead Act. In 1873, we had the Timber Culture Act. In 1877, we had the Desert Land Act. And in 1878, we had the Timber Stone Act, all of which led us homestead. And that is not some of the finer moments in Wyoming's history. Because when we came from the old country and we homesteaded and we took it, the big companies did not like us. If you've never read the story of the Johnson County War, it's well worth the read. Nick Champion was in fact part Scots. And he had 23 bullets when they got him out of the building. But lo and behold, who did not like him was big business, big industry, big stuff, and big cattlemen. And their upset partly was based on the fact you couldn't buy any more because the Congress made it all illegal. And that is our custom, our culture, and our history in respect to that. So subsequent thereto, we decided we needed to do something with our cute little doubted cattle. And our cute little doubted cattle were those cattle which were black and basically hornless. So we went to work breeding them up. And they showed up at George Grant's ranch in Kansas in 1873. So we started to convert America from red and white and mottle red and brindled and dun and roan to other colors which amounted to one. Henry Ford had it right. You can have a Model T in any color as long as it's black. Just like now you can have a cow in any color as long as it's black. And by now the saying has become very simply put, once you go black, you'll never go back. And that's sort of what's happened to our custom, culture, and heritage. So as we look through the list of what the Scots did and how we put it together, you find a Durham Brahmin cross is a Santa Gertrudis. A Durham cross with a Wagyu is a Japanese black. A Durham cross with a Highlander is a Lewing. A Murray Grey is half Durham and half Black Angus. A Belmont Red is Durham crossed with Hereford crossed with Afrikaans. An Illawarra is a Durham crossed with an Ayrshire. A Blondie Aquitaine is half Guernsey and half Durham. A Bonsmara is Dutch and Afrikander, which is Durham Afrikander cross. A Solaire is half Durham and half Aberdeen. Not its own breed, it was created by a bunch of Scotsmen who sold their Durhams to other people to upgrade their cows. A Charolais is a cross between a Durham and a Charolais, upgraded in 1890. A Norman is a cross between a Durham and a Channel Island cow. An American is a Durham Fromont de Leon cow. A Maine Anjou is a Durham Mansell. The list goes on, and polled Herefords came from a Hereford crossed with a polled Durham cow. So we drove the bus, and now we did it with the other ones. Our Angus did the same thing. What's a Chi Angus? Well, a Key Angus, but Chi Angus if you don't know how to pronounce it. Or a Maine Angus. There's a ton of them. They're bred in everything. My friends who raise registered Angus sometimes call them Angustines. Like Frankenstein, there's so much different in them now that they're all confused, and they may be. Some are more purebred than others. But what drove the best better than all was what we did with our trysting habit. The Aberdeen boys did not like the boys from the McIntosh clan. So the Aberdeen cattle were kept black, which were the cattle that were the kilos, which is the Gaelic word for boat, and I have about 60 of them. Those are black Highlanders. They're native to the west of Scotland, and they're as black as night. Black lips, black pigment, black eyes, black hide, black skin, and black horns. And those crossed with the polled cattle from South England gave us the cows the Aberdeen boys liked so much, which were the doubted black cattle that we now call Aberdeen Angus. And the McIntosh clan sorted them red because that way the Aberdeen clan couldn't steal them. And part of the reason the Aberdeen kept them black is that way the McIntosh boys couldn't steal them. It's a funny thing how theft and government drive the bus still 500 years later, isn't it? And words were even harder for one other reason, because as we spoke English, they had to tell us some interesting things we had to learn. Up is the opposite of down. Pro is the opposite of con, which now means that progress is the opposite of congress. And we got it right. So we've learned it. So that was the road we were on. And by 1900 or 1895, the depopulation of Scotland had taken off. People wanted less persons there because we wanted more deer, more open space, and more estates. So if you look carefully, you'll find entire communities of Scotland immigrated to work for other people they knew in the West. Mackenzie was here, Grant was here, Chisholm was here. They were here and they had connections to the old country. So you'll find that contract workers were sought to service British companies around the world, especially the West. Young Highlanders were targeted for ag skills, droving, breeding cows, breeding sheep, and picking them. The men from Archilbury often took work with sheep and cattle firms in the area around Billings, Montana. Others from Drumbruley and the Kyle of Lacklash were attracted to the Miles City area and ended up in a little place in Wyoming just south of Billings. And if you look at the record of the Roundup in sheep and cattle in 1910, what you will find is the record of the cattle, the record of the sheep, and the record of the Roundup is written in Gaelic. Because the boys who did the job didn't write English. They came from Lachlash, and that is what they spoke, and that is how they did it. The observation of the Scottish Land Court of 1916 in the report is a really sad thing to read to you. And I didn't really soak it into myself until about a month ago when I read it to Keith today, or he read it again today, and this is amazing. The comment in the 19 report from the Land Court of Scotland was this: unless the system of law and policy which places the preservation of deer and other game above the production of food, and which permits and encourages depopulation of the country for the pleasure of the wealthy of this and foreign nations, is reversed, this decline in population will rapidly accelerate. Younger people will, in increasing numbers, immigrate to the colonies rather than continue to bear the evils and abuses. It is 2013, and if you said instead of deer, which places the preservation of wolves, grizzly bears, sage chickens, Dolly Varden, and read the rest of the letter. You have no idea where you're going unless you have a good understanding about where you've been. The Drover Road still functions from Inverness to London. Most cattle are not trailed, they ride the train. Few people trail cattle. In my life, I've only one time been in eastern Montana in the middle of God knows where, south of Sand Springs, north of Cohagen, and here comes about 1,500 cattle and 6 guys trailing them. And they trail them from Hysham to the Missouri Breaks every year for grass all summer and trail them back. So the Drover Road, the Drover Trail we have is very much alive. It's there, you just don't see it very often anymore. So that is who we are, and that is our custom, that is our culture, and that is our heritage. And we are a national treasure. We are the Drover Road. Our parents our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and our children and their children are the Drover Road. So as they say in the other part of the world, and I will tell you, I do not buy whiskey for myself in Scotland. And the reason is simple. I don't speak it well, but I speak enough to get by. And as we say there, gan nagal, nagadigal, gan nagadigask. Here's to us and all who are worth us, and damn be our enemies. Thank you much.